Way too many political projects have been very adept at taking power, but then ended up ultimately failing because they had no answer to the following question. And then what? You acquire power, okay, fair enough, and then what? Such is the fate particularly of political projects that take a very long time to acquire power. But this sometimes happens to more established political actors too. This happens because too many political projects confuse their objectives with the answer to this question. That is incorrect. The answer to the question "and then what?" is a technocratic one rather than an ideological one. The first thing you need to do after taking power is to take the primary steps towards ensuring hegemony. Since 2024 is a super election year in at least 10 countries of interest for us, and I know this video will be watched by people involved in those campaigns, let me help you a little bit with a guide on what to do once you acquire power and before you start implementing your agenda. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so what I'm about to say is not ideological per se, though I fully do expect it to be interpreted as such, because the only people who wrote about this in the last 50 years are almost entirely leftists, with one exception, that being Olavo de Carvalho, may he rest in peace. And that's because non-leftists who understand the act of governance prefer to use that knowledge for themselves, either by acquiring power for themselves or by using the mistakes of the government for their own benefit, be it a financial one or a non-financial one. Heck, I'm guilty of that too. I never even considered writing about governance. Still, given that more and more people of my persuasion have started to acquire power in places it would have been unimaginable 8 years ago when I started this channel, let alone over 20 years ago when I started being involved in politics, perhaps it is time to have some guidance published too. Basic stuff, really. For advanced stuff, there's always private consultation. So, this is valid for nearly all methods of acquiring power, whether it's by elections, revolution, coup d'etat, it doesn't really matter that much. So, here's 10 steps to start establishing your hegemony. Step 1. Establish legitimacy internationally. This is a necessary step, regardless of the method used for acquiring power. Whether you were elected or seized power in a coup or maybe you staged a revolution, doesn't really matter. Establishing legitimacy is a must. How do you do that? Well, head straight to all of the multilateral meetings if you're prime minister or president, or have your best spoken leader do that. You must get ahead of the story, especially if you're a controversial leader. It doesn't really matter whether you're controversial or not. Do that successfully and everyone will shut up later on. Remember when Giorgia Meloni was to open concentration camps and burn gays alive? Yeah, all of that disappeared as soon as she went to several multilateral meetings. Then she effectively strong-armed the judiciary to de facto end gay marriage and gay adoption. Nobody cared. Why? Because she had established legitimacy first. Or remember how everything would turn to shit in Argentina in under a month because Javier Milei got elected and promised to use a chainsaw to cut through bureaucracy? Well, that didn't happen. A few important leaders invited at his inauguration, and suddenly even the left-wing press doesn't call him a madman anymore, even though he is implementing, or at least trying to implement, exactly the agenda that was promised in the campaign. Establishing international legitimacy is, therefore, highly important. Step 2. Establish internal legitimacy. This one is easy, and it's the only step that nearly all political projects that end up in power end up doing it right. It's easy because it requires some symbolic action that has a high impact on the plebs, but doesn't quite cost much and doesn't require much talent to implement. I don't know, fire some corrupt official that you've blamed in the campaign for being at fault for various problems or ills, or decorate some populist underdog activist who is popular in his own right or maybe even supported you. Even better if he didn't. Or in authoritarian regimes, just rehabilitate or give amnesty to some dissenters. That's how the post-communist regimes established internal legitimacy in 1989, 1990, 1991. They freed up all of the political prisoners and fired 10 or 15 people, which were the leadership of the censorship departments. There you go. The plebs loved it. Now they will recognize you as their legitimate leader. But then things become a little bit difficult. After these first two steps, most political projects start to fail, because the rest of the steps are nowhere near that easy. So, step 3, physical displacement. Now, in the United States, by tradition, whenever a new administration comes along, all of the political appointees from the previous administration resign in order to make room for the new administration's apparatus. But that doesn't always happen, although that is the tradition. But such tradition isn't always observed, and it's also something rather unique to the United States. Also, when I say physical displacement, I don't just mean the previous administration's political appointees, but a lot more than that. You see, the point of this step isn't to just put your people in charge, but to put your people at all levels. To paraphrase Olavo de Carvalho, you have power only if you physically remove the people who currently hold power and physically replace them with your own. Most political projects are content to appointing their own ministers or cabinet ministers, a few state secretaries, and maybe the heads of several regulatory agencies, and that's pretty much it. And that is also the wrong way to do it. The correct way to do it is to first paralyze every bureaucracy that you can, starting with those you can't control, by postponing the appointment of a new boss for as long as possible. You see, most agencies can't function if there isn't a director to sign off on things. Once paralyzed, then you start launching rumors. The more paranoid rumors, the better. The purpose of this is, of course, to get as many of them as possible to resign peacefully, citing mental health concerns or hostile work environment or whatever. And since the bureaucracy has no politically appointed boss, it's not your fault. It's just the legacy of the poor management by the previous administration. See how that works? It also helps if you had some of your people in those bureaucracies even before you seized power. If that's the case, then promote one of those as an interim so they can already start working on getting the most problematic employees fired. And I choose my words carefully here. Getting them fired. If that means setting them up for failure, that's okay. What's important is that as many of the old regime as possible leave more or less on their own accord, preferably of their own fault. That's one fewer mouth to feed or to negotiate with. Oh, and by the way, this includes facilitating vengeance or prosecution for things that did happen but weren't prosecuted at the time due to various reasons, including political decision by the previous administration. If the statute of limitations hasn't expired, then it's a perfectly reasonable option. Anyway, step 4. Get the institutions of force under your control. Now, I left this one at step 4 because it is important for these institutions to see what you can do to other institutions, so then you start your negotiations from a position of force, and it will then be easy for you to come off as reasonable. How? Well, how about like this? Look, I don't want to do to you what I did to, let's say, the Environmental Protection Agency or the Institute for Lesbian Research. So I'm offering you this. Work with me and I'll improve your lot. You are an essential service, unlike those clowns. Or words to that effect. The point is to intentionally drive a wedge between the security apparatus and the so-called civil servants. So many naive political projects don't understand this, and that's because they don't understand governance, or regime, if you like. Any regime that stays in power on the backs of those in the force institutions is a regime that tends to be resilient. Regimes that only rely on public support, or even worse, on academic support, don't tend to last too much. So again, any regime stays in power only if it has the force institutions on his side. And this is true regardless of your goals. As the Javier Milei administration shows us, even when you're attempting to shrink the size and scope of the regime, you still need the force institutions to cooperate with your political administration. Now, I'm not saying to become a slave of those institutions, which is why I suggested negotiating with them from a position of force, but I am saying that you need them. Also, physical displacement has to happen in these institutions as well. Nearly every level of power in the national police or the equivalent has to be occupied by someone you trust. The easiest way to do this displacement without scandal is to retire the old ones with full honors. That's how it was done in Germany after World War II, or in some post-communist countries, usually the more successful ones. This is a very effective and ultimately inexpensive tactic if your goals are revolutionary. You are, in effect, buying peace and cooperation. By retiring officers with full honors, you give them a stake in your regime. They will be less likely to join seditious or insurrectionist movements if they get a fat pension from the current regime. I will point to you again to the example of both Germanys, in fact. Nearly all of the post-communist states, also post-colonial Angola, one of the few examples that didn't go crazy after colonialism and in fact got significantly richer as a free country, the Maoist or the Stalinist way breeds resentment. So most revolutionaries of today, they're like, oh, let's just fire everyone, I don't care. That breeds resentment. In addition to being problematic, of course, if you go full Stalinist, because, killing tens of thousands of people is rarely a good thing and rarely well received. So, retiring them with honors is the best way to clean the slate in the security apparatus without creating much of a fuss. It's a proven technique that continues to pay dividends to this day, wherever it was applied. Now, once the security apparatus is firmly in your command and you replaced all of the retirees with your people, step 5, the judiciary. Now, this one can be very hard. In recent history, there is no example of doing it successfully in under 20 years. Prawo i Sprawiedliwość in Poland was close to succeeding in slightly under 20 years, but the recent electoral setback will likely postpone their version of doing things also above the 20 years benchmark. Now, when realizing how difficult this is, many political projects just throw up their hands in the air and say, well, nothing can be done, and then move on to other things. That is wrong. The purpose of the regime is to establish hegemony. You won't have hegemony without a friendly judiciary. Even if you fail at fully reforming the judiciary, any new change you manage to implement is an important step. Now, it, of course, depends on the system. In the US, a lot of the judiciary is in fact directly voted by the plebs. In such cases, targeted propaganda may be enough to start filling up the judiciary with your people. In Europe, however, the game of pretense is still on. What game of pretense? Well, this crazy idea that the judiciary is somehow not political. Of course, the idea is enforced selectively. Germany's politicized judiciary is perfectly kosher, but Poland's isn't. Still, regardless of the context, it is incumbent upon you to try to fill in as many positions as possible in the judiciary with your people, starting with prosecutors and ending with the Supreme or Constitutional Court judges. All levels must be targeted. Don't fool yourself. The previous regime did exactly the same. That's why it took you so long to end up in power. Ultimately, if you don't establish hegemony, you will live your political project under the hegemony of the previous regime, which will eventually kick you out of power. It really is that simple. Step 6. Education. Regardless of your persuasion or your agenda, failing to take over the education is a failure of your political project. End of story. There's just no way around that. And when I say take over education, I mean it physically too, not just ideologically. It is incumbent upon you to do whatever it takes to physically replace as many people who wield power in education with your own people. In countries or jurisdictions with state universities, those are the first obvious target, but you just shouldn't stop there. Most curricula, especially for, I guess Americans would call it K-12 or the equivalent, is decided in obscure committees with no public oversight. Now that's bad, but it also means that they can be abolished and replaced via an executive order or a ministerial decree, and there's nothing the former regime apparatchiks can do about it. In some countries of Europe, the content of the textbooks is also regulated by the government. If that is the case, the committee or the sub-institution that regulates that must be immediately filled up with your people. And by next school year, children should be studying from your books with your slant in them. None of this should be publicized, mind you. You don't brag about it, you just do it. Fast and deep without leaving time for the apparatchiks to mount an opposition. In parallel, you foster resentment and distrust in the current education system, so by the time your reforms start being called out, you will simply say, "Oh yeah, of course, I'm just fixing what society already knows it's wrong," and then proceed to only quote the complaints that have been narratively arranged by your people. Ideally, have your people create the ventriloquist structure beforehand. Ventriloquism is a stagecraft term. It's basically talking with yourself by means of other people. The European Union does this all the time. They hold consultations about a topic, usually something marginal that nobody cares about, but it's highly important for the far-left ideological agenda of the European Commission. And of course, in those consultations, by pure coincidence, representative organizations show up at the consultation that just happen to all agree mostly with the Commission. Then the Commission writes a report that they've consulted with the relevant groups and then push for a new policy. Well, that's not a technique that is specific for the European Union. Any political project can create such an infrastructure and use it to advance its own policy. The most advanced in this department are the younger conservatives in the United States. And I don't refer here to projects like Moms for Liberty or others that run for school boards. Now, there's nothing wrong with those, mind you, but those are also very necessary. But for the purposes of this talk, projects like the ones where people like Chris Rufo are involved, that is what you need. Think tanks that write policy. If you end up in power, you just implement those. You organize consultations where you only invite the think tanks that are favorable to you, and then distribute propaganda that the opinions of those think tanks aren't just opinions, but settled science. If you fail to even try to do this, sorry to say, your political project is a failure. Step 7. Media. Once you're in power, a lot of levers of power become available to you that weren't there when you weren't in power, obviously. Even if you have $1 billion to use for propaganda, you will still be at a disadvantage compared to the Prime Minister or Chancellor or President or whatever the top executive position is called. Once you're in power, you should absolutely try to buy journalists. The top ones at the very least. And if you can't, then you should work to get them fired from their top publications and then replace them with your people. If your country has a state media, it goes without saying that with the exception of the janitor, nobody's job there should be safe. If it's the state media, then it has to serve your ideological goals. And the easiest way is to populate it with your people. That may not always be possible, but a combination between bribery, intimidation, firing, and hiring should do most of the job. Don't fall for the, "Oh, but my independence of the newsroom" crap. No. There's no such thing. The owner is always in charge. If the owner is the state and you are the prime minister, you are in charge. Put your people in there and fire anyone who disagrees. If the state media has a good reputation in the country, then exploit it to further your goals. If the state media has a terrible reputation in the country, then exploit the opportunity to trumpet how your reforms will make it better. And don't be shy. Go straight for the jugular. Introduce ideologically inspired programming from day one without any shame. Your enemies have been doing it since forever. Step 8. Civil society. 7 years ago, I made a video on this channel called The False Civil Society and Government Charities, and I suggest you watch it if you haven't done so already. Basically, most of the so-called civil society in the current year, and was 7 years ago as well, is in fact Gramscian. That is to say, it is a false civil society meant to uphold the regime. Once you become the regime, it is incumbent upon you to meddle in this sector as well. Again, regardless of your persuasion, even if your ultimate goal is to dismantle it, you still need to take over it first in order to have a legitimate force sign off on its dismantlement. In most countries, this point isn't particularly expensive financially speaking, which is why no administration works to dismantle it, but it yields great dividends. In Europe, the only political project that took this point serious in the last 50 years was, again, Prawo i Sprawiedliwość in Poland. They relentlessly evaluated and re-evaluated all state funding for so-called cultural and civil matters and mercilessly purged any organization that leaned left. With the savings, they then proceeded to fund their own activists, their own indie theaters, which they have then aggressively promoted on the state media. And they funded their own NGOs, and so on and so forth. In a reasonably developed country, this is less than 0.002% of the budget. But you get a lot in return. For starters, you get to pay your most hardline activists, and if you're good at this, you get to use state money to school new activists. Again, this is what every serious political project does. The fact that conservatives are too pussified to do this is the fault of conservatives. And again, even if your ultimate goal is to dismantle this, please do keep in mind that the next one after you will bring it back, and even if to dismantle it, you still need to take over it first. Step 9. Urban development and infrastructure. A lot of people are seriously brainwashed into thinking that this matter isn't political. Of course it's political. The worldview of the decision maker is the decisive factor in what gets built and what doesn't. And if you're smart, you take over this department and fill it up with your people, who then develop policy that explicitly privileges your voters and your supporters to the explicit detriment of the voters of the opposition. That way, you create or expand a permanent voter base. There are political parties in Europe that still make it into the parliament even though they should have died a long time ago, solely because when they were in power decades ago, they built some piece of infrastructure in some place that had been ignored by other administrations. I can't emphasize this enough. Urban planning and infrastructure are very political and in and of themselves an important step towards establishing hegemony. Again, I'm assuming you want power rather than be an idealistic autist on the internet, so there's that. And finally, step 10, small bureaucracies. Only after you did the first 9, you can then take care of small or lesser known bureaucracies. Now, of course, it doesn't necessarily mean have to complete the first 9. Again, the judiciary might take a long time, but still, only after you address the first 9, you can start going off after the lesser known bureaucracies, but you have to. Either if you want to abolish them, as it is my preference, or to transform them, it doesn't matter. It's still an important step towards establishing hegemony. These things come later and not at first, if the goal is hegemony. And here, in the small bureaucracies, there's a lot of things. My favorites for reform through dismantlement are public health, anything that has environmental in its name, almost everything that has safety in its name or statute, and anything that can't easily be used to persecute the opposition. Remember, any bureaucracy that doesn't explicitly serve your agenda is implicitly serving the opposition. It's really that simple. I know this from experience. Whenever I work with a political actor that is in opposition, among the first things we try is to find bureaucracies and smaller centers of power that have not been filled with regime apparatchiks, and of course, we try to fill that bureaucracy, well, with our people. So yeah, that's really the introduction to the correct answer to the question, and then what? It's a very technocratic answer, really. And all I said here should be started right away, in the day of the inauguration, really. So what I'm saying is that political projects have to be prepared for it. Have the ventriloquist infrastructure in place before acquiring power. Have people in your network that know the details of these highly specific things. The reason so many political projects fail is because not only they fail to understand governance, but they're also not prepared or willing to build a regime. Building a regime is more complicated but also more lasting than building a cabinet. The reason Syriza failed in Greece, a deeply left-wing country, is not because their ideas about economics suck. The electorate knew that already and voted for them precisely because they wanted socialism. But Syriza was formed primarily of naive idealists and pseudo-academic grifters. Yanis Varoufakis became a media sensation, but he knew very little about how to run a bureaucracy. A political project that is serious about governing has these things separate. Normally, the Minister of Finance should be someone that has the charisma of a potato and whose name and face everyone forgets. Because the point of the Minister of Finance is to do the accounting in accordance to the political agenda that is determined by the Prime Minister via the political party, not the other way around. There also are examples with mixed results, like for instance the Donald Trump political project. On education, this worked out great. The measures from Betsy DeVos were good and created the foothold necessary for systemic opposition to the regime to flourish. The results are visible today to the delight of the right wing and the horrors of the left, which sees its work demolished just as methodically as they've built it. Same goes on immigration. Under the advice of Stephen Miller, one of the few people in Trump's inner circle that actually knew how to regime, the Trump project managed to create hegemony. It may not be entirely visible yet, but the numbers don't lie. Here's from Reuters, quote, as US President Joe Biden works to undo many of the restrictive immigration policies enacted by former President Donald Trump, he will confront one of his predecessors' indelible legacies: the legion of immigration judges Trump's administration has hired. The administration filled 2/3 of the immigration court's 520 lifetime positions with judges who, as a whole, have disproportionately ordered deportation, according to a Reuters analysis of more than 800,000 immigration cases decided over the past 20 years. Judges hired under Trump administration ordered immigrants deported in 69% of cases, compared to 58% for judges hired as far back as the administration of President Ronald Reagan. Because hundreds of thousands of immigrants have cases before the court each year, that 11 percentage point difference translates to tens of thousands more people deported each year. Appeals are rarely successful. Hiring wasn't the only thing that changed under Trump. The immigration judges who led the training in 2020 had on average much higher deportation rates than those in 2016, before Trump took office. In their own court cases, the Trump administration training judges ordered immigrants deported 75% of the time, while trainers in 2016 had a deportation rate of 58%. The immigration judge tasked with teaching judges how to determine the credibility of immigrants had a personal deportation rate of 89%, with 37% for the comparable trainer in 2016, unquote. So, basically, what Reuters is saying is that the hegemony is there. Trump has been out of office for years, yet new judges are being trained into his administration's worldview. Master move by Stephen Miller. That is how you do it. Unfortunately, the Trump project was far less successful in other areas, such as media. In fact, the Trump project didn't even try to shut down or reform the NPR, and that's terrible. Millions of American NPCs listen to NPR in their cars. Reaching those with your propaganda is critical to establishing hegemony of your regime. The Trump project didn't even try. There are plenty of examples of political projects, both on the left and on the right, that failed primarily because they didn't follow this template. But there are far more examples on the right lately. Historically, things were relatively balanced, but from 1990 onwards, the number of non-leftist political projects failing at these, I would say, basic tasks outnumber leftist ones by 2 to 1, or in some years even more than that. Right-wingers of today seem to be afraid of wielding power even when they acquire it. Most left-wing blunders on establishing hegemony are due to technicalities or too strong of an opposition, rarely due to incompetence, though the Greek example is one of incompetence. But most right-wing blunders are due to lack of will and incompetence. Right-wingers don't learn how to govern anymore, which is also why I'm inconsistently surprised, pleasantly, by how Javier Milei is governing. I mean, at least he is governing. His team knows the procedures, and in the background, his administration is in fact going through this very same list that I presented here. But Milei is rather an exception, unfortunately. Places to learn how to govern that are not communist cesspools are rare and far between. I mean, in Europe, where do you learn this? Now you have Institut de Formation Politique in France, I guess Collegium Intermarium in Poland, and that's really kinda it. And it's not like European countries didn't have right-wing governments over the last 30 years, they did. But almost none of them tried to establish hegemony by either taking over an existing institution or by intentionally divesting away from leftist institutions and investing in one for themselves. And that my fellow deplorables, is a strategic mistake for which we are all still paying for. It's a mistake made mostly by our forefathers, yes, and if you're under 40 now and you're not a leftist, you're paying for the mistakes made by right-wingers who are now age 70 or older. You know, those older, real conservatives who know it all, utter bollocks. Their generation made things worse and continues to make them worse today. So the lesson in this video is threefold. 1. Adjust your planning in accordance to the technocratic answers to the "and then what?" question. You don't have to take my list. Go ahead and read Antonio Gramsci. He made the same case 100 years ago, but from the left. The second lesson is that if you're not willing to wield power, then you should stop seeking it. It's okay to not want to wield power. Heck, I sometimes don't want to either, and I know how. And I spend most of my adult life in circles of power, both state and corporate. But in such moments, when I'm not fully committed to wield the power that I seek, what I do is withdraw from the project or don't sign up to begin with. Too many non-leftist projects have been excessively inclusive under the banner that such and such person is a good person. Well, you know what? I don't care. A political project of 10,000 people willing to wield power correctly will be far more successful than a political project of 1,000,000 good people who are afraid to wield power. Moreover, acquiring power and then not using it in time compromises your ideals as well. In some countries of Europe, large political parties have stayed out of power for a decade or more because of one generation that was afraid to wield power. The electorate can be merciless. And when I say wield power correctly, I don't use the adjective correctly in an ideological or moral sense, but again, in a very technocratic sense. For the third lesson of this video is this: learn procedure. That's how you wield power correctly. During the pandemic project, we popularized the say here on the sofa. Procedura este Dumnezeu. Procedure is God. You can have the best policy ideas in human existence. If you don't know the procedures that you have to activate in order to implement them, it will not matter. There's a reason the most powerful and effective activists are less known to the public. Heck, before social media, they were effectively unknown to the general public altogether, and it was impossible for the public to even learn who they are. Why? Because effective activists don't prioritize raising their own profile, but rather forwarding the agenda to which or towards which they agitate for. And an effective activist, or political operative if you want, will try to bring his slate in power so he becomes a regime foot soldier. Those who succeed at that definitely know procedure, like Stephen Miller, or Chris Rufo, or Leonard Leo. These, and others like them, are men well versed in procedure, or governance if you don't like the term procedure. During the pandemic project, we made the lives miserable to as many branch Covidians as we could, and most of the time it was thanks to using bureaucratic or judicial procedure against them, in addition to propaganda, gaslighting, and other tools, of course, from the agitprop toolbox. So, to sum up, the correct route is this. While you struggle to gain power, pay attention to networking and then build the ventriloquist infrastructure. Once in power, reward your supporters, purge your opponents, and start the process of establishing hegemony. Then, and only then, after you at least tried to do all of these and started working on them, then you start implementing your agenda. Sure, Javier Milei is a bit lucky because he inherited such a complicated situation that he can do both at the same time. But you won't have this context in Europe or in North America or Central Asia or most of the rest of the world, really. In most of the rest of the world, it's a methodical process. It doesn't necessarily have to last years or decades, but there is an order, a procedure on how to do things. And again, this holds true regardless of your ultimate intentions and oftentimes regardless of how you acquired power. I mean, take a look at the military junta in Myanmar. They acquired power, and yet 3 years later, 4 years later now, they failed to even attempt to establish some semblance of hegemony. When they will fall from power, nothing will remain from their legacy. Now, it just so happens that them falling from power would also be a good thing for the Burmese people, but from a strictly technical or technocratic point of view, the Myanmar junta is already a failure, regardless of whether they will succeed in fending off the rebels and win the current civil war or not, doesn't matter. So yeah, learn technique and learn how to use the levers of power. Otherwise, simply acquiring power and then not using it does more harm than remaining in opposition. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous financial support. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.